Okay, so Brother Nick is now going to talk about Nehemiah and his courage. Brother Nick.
Good morning, everybody. I say that there's no excuse to be sad today because it's sunny and it's 50 degrees. I mean, when was the last time it's been 50 degrees in this place for a while? So, I mean, let's embrace the day while we have a chance, because it's one of the few days that's going to be good for us, and we thank God that we have an opportunity to have such days like these. I'd like to start with some quotes about courage from different other sources of people. The first is from Mark Twain. Courage is resistance to fear, mastery of fear, but not the absence of fear. The second is from Aristotle. The ideal man bears the accidents of life with dignity and grace, making the best of circumstances. And the last is from T.S. Eliot. Only those who will risk going too far can possibly find out how far one can go. Regardless of maybe some of our differences, I think we can all agree that we're going to face adversity. We're going to be challenged for our beliefs, for our nationality, for our ideas, for whatever. And especially within this day and age, I think people are more divided than they've ever been before. It's perhaps no time more than ever than this time is it difficult to stay faithful when so many others around you are not staying faithful. It's a struggle for many, not just facing external pressure, but also for young people like myself who have internal doubts, internal pressure about how I can serve or what I can do to serve my fellow brothers and sisters in my community. Except I remembered something that Jesus explicitly told us, and this was in John chapter 15, verses 18 to 25. If the world hates you, keep in mind that it hated me first. For if you belong to the world, it would love you as you yourself loves it. As it is, you do not belong to the world, but I have chosen you out of the world. That is why the world hates you. Remember what I told you, that a servant is not greater than his master. If they have persecuted me, they will persecute you as well. If you have obeyed my teachings, if they had obeyed my teachings, they will obey yours as well. They will treat you this way because of my name, for they do not know the one who sent me. If I had not come and spoken to them, they would not be guilty of sin. But now they have no excuse for their sin. Whoever hates me hates my Father as well. If I had not done the works that they did, they would not be guilty of sin. But as it is, they have seen, and yet they hate me for both myself and my Father. But this is to fulfill what is written in the law. They hated me without reason. It's a good reminder that when we suffer, it's also important to keep in mind that Jesus himself suffered with us, and that he, at the end of the day, took himself up upon the cross and sacrificed his life to give us this chance to come together as brothers and sisters in the faith and to praise and extol his name forever. Today, I'm going to tell you a story. The story of Nehemiah. It's not a story that I've heard talked about a lot, and admittedly, it's not one of the first 5 stories that come to my mind when I think of Bible stories, but it's a great story. It's a story of struggle against incredible odds and dangerous tasks. It's a story of a people trying to rebuild what has been destroyed and decayed. It is a story of enemies both external and internal. Yet as well, it is the story of a man who stayed steadfast faith in the Lord, and a victory in the long and tumultuous history of God's chosen people. The story begins in 445 BC. It's been several decades after the Israelites were placed into exile by Nebuchadnezzar and by God's will. It's 13 years after Ezra had arrived in Jerusalem, bringing back some of the exiles. Beforehand, the people had been exiled by God to foreign nations for disobedience to his commandments and his word. Yet even now, despite that, God had remembered his servant Abraham and the promise that he made to Abraham that his people were chosen. And now he was carrying out that promise he made to Abraham, renewing these people. Our story begins with Nehemiah in the court of King Artaxerxes. And yes, I had to look that up because I didn't know how to pronounce it. So if you didn't know how to pronounce it, that's fine. I didn't either. In King Artaxerxes, in his court, Nehemiah's face is clearly stricken with grief. As we read in the opening verse, Nehemiah is heartbroken because the city, the people he loved, are in ruins. So in chapter 2 in verse 1, in the month of Nisan, in the 20th year of King Artaxerxes, when the wine was before him, I took up the wine and gave it to the king. Now I had not been sad in his presence, and the king said to me, "Why is your face sad, seeing as though you are not sick? It is nothing but the sadness of the heart." Then I was very much afraid. And here we see the first challenge for Nehemiah is bringing his plea before the king. This king is a foreign king. He is not a king who is aware of the Israelites. So he does not know the struggles. He's bringing a great risk here because he's going to ask for something that might bring about challenges. So in verse 3, I was said to the king, "Let the king live forever. Why should not my face be sad? When the city, the place of my father's graves, lies in ruins, and its gates have been destroyed by fire." Then the king said to me, "What is it that you are requesting?" And so I prayed to the God of heaven. And I said to the king, "If it pleases the king, and if your servant has found favor in your sight, that you send me to Judah, to the city of my father's graves, that I may rebuild it." And the king had said to me, "How long will you be gone, and when will you return?" So it pleased the king to send me when I had given him a time, and I said to the king, "If it pleases the king, let letters be given to me, to the governors of province and beyond the river, that they may let me pass through until I come to Judah, and to a letter of Asaph, the keeper of the king's forest, that he might give me timber to make the beams for the gates of the fortress of the temple, and for the wall of the city, for my house shall occupy." And the king granted me what I had asked, for the good hand of God was upon me. Again, it is a great risk for Nehemiah, yet through the grace of God, he overcomes the first trial. And yet, his struggle is not nearly over. For in verse 10, skipping ahead to verse 10, "But when Sanballat the Horonite and Tobiah the Ammonite servant heard this, it displeased them greatly, for someone had come to seek the welfare for the people of Israel." And here we see the beginning of our antagonists of this story, the people who will attempt to oppose Nehemiah in his goal of reconstructing and rebuilding the walls of Jerusalem. Initially, it might just come off as that they just don't like Israelites. It seems like, that they just are anti-Semitic. They just don't like the Israelites for what they are. But after doing a bit of my own little research, it turns out that Sanballat and Tobiah are peoples of power within Samaria. So one of the reasons that they're very likely afraid of why Nehemiah wants to rebuild the walls is that it could weaken their own power over the areas of Judah and over the Israelites still living in that area, the people still living in that area. So it's not so much maybe they do hate the people, but it's more about it's a challenge to their power. And because of that, it's a challenge to their power. They're going to try and stop it by any means necessary. Also, on a little side note here, Tobiah is actually a Jewish name, but he's an Ammonite, which is one of Israel's historic enemies. So I just found it a little interesting that Tobiah has a Jewish name, but he's one of Israel's historical enemies. Just something I thought a little poke fun. We skip ahead to verse 17 through 20, and here, skipping a bit ahead, Nehemiah had inspected the walls of Jerusalem. And he would say to the others, and he said to them, "You see the trouble we are in, for Jerusalem lies in ruins. Its gates have been burned with fire. Come, let us rebuild the wall of Jerusalem, and we will no longer be in disgrace." And I also told them the gracious hand of my God was upon me, and what the king had said to me. They replied, "Let us start rebuilding." And so they began this good work. They began the process of rebuilding the walls, renewing themselves for God. But when Sanballat the Horonite, and Tobiah the Ammonite, and Geshem the Arab heard about it, they mocked and ridiculed us. "What is this that you are doing?" they said. "Are you rebelling against the king?" And that right there, that is dangerous, what they said, what they just accused Nehemiah of doing. That's a serious offense. That they're saying, "Are you rebelling against the king by rebuilding these walls?" That could have Nehemiah imprisoned, or worse, he could be killed for something like that. Yet Nehemiah, in his bravery, answers them with such a brilliant response. "The God of heaven will give us success. We, his servants, will start the rebuilding. But as for you, you have no share in Jerusalem or any claim or historic right to it." What I like here is that, yes, Nehemiah got permission from the king to rebuild the city walls, but he doesn't attribute the credit to the king specifically. He attributes it to God. He attributed it that was from God's will, that God had given him the grace and the mercy to renew himself and rebuild these walls. He's also convinced that this is opposition by them, from Sanballat and the others, to the Lord. And it's that last part, he says, "You have no historic claim or right to it," means that he's not going to bother himself with these arguments, because as far as he's concerned, they are putting themselves against the Lord, and he has nothing to be afraid of, for the Lord is with him, and the Lord has given him grace and mercy. Places the authority rightly with God and his will, to remind us that it was not King Artaxerxes who gave him the authority to rebuild the city, but that it was God's will to redeem his people and to rebuild these walls for his great name. So in chapter 3, they rebuild most of the wall, and most of that is statistics of how the peoples and different supplies and whatnot, and I'm going to skip over that. Not to say that that's not important, but I'm focusing mainly on the opposition in the story here. So we skip ahead to chapter 4. We can now see that the opposition is growing fiercer. As the people are closer to completely rebuilding, they do something, I think, a little crazy here. They start praying against Sanballat and the others. They start praying against Nehemiah to stop the halt and the work. It's in verses 4. Forgive me for a second, I'm getting my verses mixed up. It's in verses 4 and 5. "Hear us, O God, for we are despised. Turn their back their tongue on their head, and give them up to be plundered in a land where they are captives. Do not cover their guilt, and let not their sin be blotted out from your sight, for they have provoked you to anger in the presence of the builders." And that's what Sanballat and the others are saying. They're praying to God against Nehemiah, even though Nehemiah had been given authority to do such things. So now it seems as though his new opposition, they're trying to somehow turn God against Nehemiah and the others, but we know that that's not going to happen, because Nehemiah has already received the good grace of God. Yet Nehemiah is afraid of the others, and things are getting worse, because in verses 8 and 9, Sanballat and the others had all plotted to come and fight against Jerusalem to cause confusion in it. Yet we prayed to our God and set a guard of protection against them day and night. Now he's facing direct action. Now he's facing potential revolt and war. He's facing enemies who now probably are seeking his life. And now the pressure is not just from external pressure, but now the pressure comes from internal. For in verse 10, in Judah it was said that the strength of those who are bearing the burdens is failing. There is trouble. By ourselves we will not be able to rebuild this wall. And our enemies said they will not know or see when we come upon them and kill them and stop the work. And yet, at verse 14, Nehemiah looked and arose and said to the nobles and the officials and all the greats and all the rest of the people, "Do not be afraid of them. Remember the Lord, who is great and awesome and fights for your brothers and your sons and your daughters and your wives and your homes." And I like this because this is a reflection of what God had told Joshua earlier. Do not be afraid, for I have given this land to you. And I believe Nehemiah remembered that promise, remembered that God had given them this land, and that he is renewing his people. And that if Nehemiah had made it this far, progressing with the king's blessing and with this group of people being able to rebuild, that he has God's blessing to renew himself and rebuild himself for these people. It's a reminder to ourselves that we have the Almighty Lord on our side, and that though we will face trouble and tribulation, we are protected by our God, our King, and that we are his people just as much as if we bow ourselves and bring ourselves before him, he won't let us suffer into harm and struggle, for we are his people and he is our God. And once again, we can see that God protects Nehemiah and protects the people. For in verse 15, our enemies had heard that it was known to us, for it was God's will to frustrate their plan. We had all returned to the wall, each to his work. Nehemiah once again does not waver, but prays to the Lord. The very first action he takes is prayer to the Lord for protection and safety. Protection and safety to protect themselves, to ask him for protection and for his blessing to continue the work. And now we reach the point where the wall is reaching completion, that they are about to succeed in rebuilding what has been destroyed. And once again, the conspirators now reach a point of desperation. And in their attempts to stop the progress, they are now turning to trickery to defeat Nehemiah. They tried accusing him of rebelling against the king. That did not work. They tried taking direct action through violence and threat, but that also did not work. So now they are turning to deceitfulness and trickery to try and defeat Nehemiah. And in Nehemiah chapter 6, verses 1 through 4, now when Sanballat and Tobiah and Geshem the Arab and the rest of our enemies had heard that I had built the wall and that there was no breach left in it, Sanballat and Geshem sent to me, saying, "Come, let us meet together at Hekaphirim in the plains of Ono." But they intended to do me harm. And I sent messengers to them, saying, "I am doing a great work and cannot come down. Why should I stop the work and leave it and come down to you?" And they sent to me 4 times in this way, and 4 times I had answered them in the same manner. Then in verse 5, in the same way Sanballat sent for the 5th time his servant to me with an open letter in his hands. And when it says open letter, that means that this open letter is not just between him and Nehemiah. Now it's public. It's made known to many more people. And in verse 6, it is written, "It is reported among the nations," and Geshem also says it, "that you Jews intend to rebel. That is why you are building this wall. And according to these reports, you wish to become their king. And you have also set up prophets to proclaim concerning you in Jerusalem, there is a king in Judah. And now the king hears of these reports, so come and let us take counsel together." Indeed, there is a king in Judah, but it is not Nehemiah. That king is yet to come. This is by far the greatest and most dangerous threat, because now they're outright accusing the Jews of rebelling against Artaxerxes and the rule of the Persians, and this will no doubt inflame the wrath of the Persians. This is by far the greatest threat, because this could now utterly destroy everything that they had worked so hard towards. In verse 9, he says, "They frightened us into thinking that their hands will drop from their work and it will not be done. But now, O God, strengthen my hands." Once again, Nehemiah turns to the Lord in his grace and in his mercy, when so many others probably would have just thrown in the towel and say, "I can't do this anymore." Once again, Nehemiah shows steadfast courage and faith in God and turns to God once again for help. And what a brilliant, brilliant man he is. Then when so many others would have faltered, he did not falter. And would instead turn to God because he knew that the Lord was on his side and put his faith in him that this could be done. And so, even later, they hired the priest Shemaiah to convince him to hide in the temple. For in verse 10, "Now I went to the house of Shemaiah, the son of Delaiah, son of Metabel, who was confined to his home, and he said, 'Let us meet together in the house of the Lord within the temple. Let us close the doors of the temple, for they are coming to kill you, and they are coming to kill you by night.' But I replied, 'Such as a man should I run away? And what a man should I go into the temple and live? No, I will not go in.' And I understood that God had not sent him, but pronounced his prophecy against me because Tobiah and Sanballat hired him." Once again, he turns to the Lord, and he remembers that he can't go in the temple because that's not right. It's not a place for him to be in. He remembered that, and he prayed to the Lord, and he knew that the Lord had not sent Shemaiah. And so it is that in verse 15 and 16, "And so the wall was finished on the 25th day, in the month of Elul, in the 52 days. And when our enemies had heard of it, all the nations around us were afraid, and fell greatly on their own esteem, for they perceived that the work had been accomplished with the help of our God." There is more to the story of Nehemiah. This is not the sole story of Nehemiah. There is much more to his story. But I'm going to end off here because this is the greatest triumph that Nehemiah has reached. They had realized that now it was not just Nehemiah and the people that realized they had been getting help from the Lord, but now we can see that all the nations have realized that this was the will of God, and this was a sign that he was renewing his covenant to his servant Abraham, to Isaac, to Jacob, to all of those who had believed in him, and that now he was restoring the city of Israel after being lost for so many years, being sent into exile and persecution. The time had finally come for him to restore his people to the land that they were promised. Brothers and sisters, you need not be afraid of the dangers that this world can bring upon you, for the world that we live in now is but a moment. It is but a short moment in the great and powerful plan that God has set in motion for us. God has a plan for everybody in this room. For you, for me, for everyone. And God's plan is tried and true. He will not bring harm upon you. Turn to the Lord and ask for his mercy, and he will give it to you. I will close with John chapter 16, 31 to 33. "Do you now believe?" Jesus replied. "A time is coming, and in fact you will be scattered, each to your own home. You will all leave me alone, but yet I am not alone, for the Father is with me. I have told you all these things so that you might have peace. In this world you will have trouble, but take heart. I have overcome the world."